the question put to us is looking towards Europe East. It's very broad. First of all, we might ask, what is Europe East? Secondly, who is looking? From which point of view? Institutional point of view, experts' point of view, you know, God-fearing, good-willing people look, you know, human rights activists. It's all different perspectives. And the fact that we are looking at Europe's East suggests that we are actually going to look at what? Russia, Ukraine, and other Eastern Partnership countries. It's a very broad definition. Are we going to go to Azerbaijan, or how far we can end up in China? I think that leaves members of the panel a very broad scope for discussion, but let's start with trying to determine what the situation is. And before we go into Eastern Partnership countries, the countries which Poland cares about very much, let's start with Russia. And the question which many people ask themselves, and the answers given are different depending on the day of the week, or depending on what Putin does or doesn't do in Moscow, is what is there about the Putin's foreign policy, Putin 2, so we call? Is it just a continuity, expresses continuity of the, you know, long-term Russian strategy toward the West, or is there something new? Another question is Putin's foreign policy a reflection of the internal situation of Russia, or is it something totally autonomous there? And I would like to ask for short comments here. Professor Rotfeld. Maybe. Professor Rotfeld, I'm not giving you the CVs because it's all in description. Professor Rotfeld is an authority and he deals with Russia professionally, and Russia have been dealing with him throughout his life as well.
No. Thank you very much. I would like to say that, in fact, the question you raised could be responded in a very simple way. One can say that neither continuity nor change, but it is both continuity and change. Continuity in the sense that Russia, as many people believe that Russia has a kind of the ground strategy. In my view, it is not the case. They do react to the new realities. And these realities were, on different stages, quite different. They initiated in the period of Yeltsin with Kozyrev, a totally different type of policy. Then it was changed with Prime Minister Putin, still under President Yeltsin, a policy which was oriented to the West with an intention to establish a new type of the directorate. In other words, point number one is that one element which is definitely within this continuity strategy as a product of the ongoing process is an intention to reestablish the status of Russia as a global power, which was the case in the Cold War period. And this global power, in the period of the fundamental line of division between East and West, where Russia played a role as the center of the totalitarian world, is gone. In other words, it is not possible to reestablish something what is already the part of the history. But nevertheless, they have a type of tendency. My last point I would like to say in this context is that not only in Russia, but in all powers of the world, almost in all the countries of the world, we are in the period where the relations between the states, they do not reflect the relationship between the states, but mainly they are byproduct of the situation within the country. In other words, what is going on in Russia is much more decisive for the Russian foreign and security policy than the relations between Russia and the West, Russia and the European Union, NATO, or Russia and Poland. What is going about, for example, Polish foreign policy, it is the same. The situation in Poland is much more decisive for our policy towards Russia than the relations between Russia and Poland. In other words, my last point is the following, that all of us, we are to some extent the hostages of the past. We were educated, we were formed, we have an experience of the past, and we do consider that it is a continuity. But we did not notice, many of us, and especially politicians, they do not have time to think that situation changed dramatically. It is a fundamental change of circumstances. They do consider that the world is homogeneous, but the world is in fact heterogeneous. And one should define the policy a new one. In other words, it is not enough to continue the strategy towards the Arab world, towards Central Eastern Europe or Russia. One should see the situation is totally different, and the other elements should be taken under consideration.
Thank you very much.
I will stop here.
Dr. Wallander, understanding what Professor Rotfeld says is that Russia tries to renegotiate its relation with the West, with the outside world. That means coming from the position of weakness of the 90s, using different mechanisms, different expressions of its anger or ambitions, including the Georgia war, for example. Would you agree with that? Renegotiating, using different methods? Military, non-military?
So I was almost afraid that I was going to have to disagree with Professor Rotfeld, which is, you know, a really bad thing to do because he's right all the time. So there are always elements of continuity and change, and obviously continuity is important. History, geography, many of the elements we've talked about. What I want to highlight are the elements of change in the new Russian foreign policy direction. And here's where, though, I think that the change is rooted in Russia's internal situation, and that's where we strongly agree. Russian foreign policy, or I should say the Putin regime's foreign policy right now, is driven by the Putin leadership's illegitimacy and insecurity. No one in this room who could do a strong analysis of the assault on the political opposition, the attempt to constrain, undermine, and hold off civil society, none of us who could do that are any smarter than the Russian leadership. They are very well aware of their illegitimacy, and they are very well aware of the change in Russian society, which has led to the protests and will continue to lead to sources of weakness of the political leadership going forward. Okay, and so the reason that foreign policy. So the connection to foreign policy, though, is not necessarily a good thing. So in other words, Russian weakness is creating a very significant challenge for the United States and for Europe. Because I think that the Putin leadership truly believes, it doesn't just say this for internal consumption purposes, which is the standard way to write this off. I think we need to take seriously that the Putin leadership sincerely worries about democratization, human rights, modernization, international integration, and all these elements of what are positive foreign policies on the part of the United States and Europe towards the East as being directed exactly at their source of weakness and illegitimacy. And it is within that frame that all these other elements of foreign policy flow. And I will stop there, so I think you get the framework. But I think that I would emphasize, while agreeing that there are very important sources of continuity, I think we need to take seriously that this is a new situation and we need new strategies and new policies to cope with it.
All right, so I will go immediately into the question of Western response, and when I mean Western, I mean institutional response. First of all, of the European Union, and second of NATO. European Union is muddling through. Russia is a very difficult partner, doesn't want to sign agreements, even agreed about 10 or 12 years ago, like Partnership and Cooperation Agreement or energy treaty. Just says no, and the negotiation goes on. The high-powered meetings, the summits, lead to nowhere, like the last one. So where are we? A very practical question. You've been on the group of wise men and women to prepare the strategy of NATO. Is the NATO-Russia Council a useful tool of cooperation?
Yes, definitely. And I would like to say that, by the way, I have had twice personal contact with Putin. One of them, the first one was in January 2005. And in fact, it was very delicate situation between President Kwaśniewski and Putin. And Putin didn't want, in fact, to accept to be the guest of Kwaśniewski. He did not respond to his questions. And then in order, I would say, to somehow to warm up a little bit the situation, I raised the question, may I ask about something totally different than the subject? And both of them said, yes, yes. I said, Mr. President, I have the feeling that you are considering now OSCE, Organization on Security and Cooperation in Europe, as something marginal, detrimental, negative. But you have at the same time much more positive approach to NATO. And he said, yes, you are absolutely right. NATO is a serious organization. We do consider NATO as a very serious partner. I'm telling you that, in fact, in Russia, NATO has much stronger position than the members of NATO. They do believe what NATO at the moment means. In other words, among many Western members of Western democratic members of NATO, it is a kind of feeling that NATO is now much weaker than we would like to see the organization. Alliance is not playing the same role, and the alliance within the new strategic concept defined to some extent, not against, but I would say in addition to the Washington Treaty, two other elements, because alliance originally was identified with Article number 5. Now, in addition, you have, I would say, the collective self-defense, Article 5, but two other aims were defined, I would say, crisis management and cooperative collective security.
And was it helpful in respect to
in other words, NATO-Russia Council is within these three new aims. They are known in the NATO strategic concept as core tasks. And in fact, Russia is very much interested, and this is, I would say, within the NATO-Russia Council, the main Russian expectation is that it should not be a meeting 28 plus 1, but 29. In other words, to have a kind of the droit de regard within the structures of NATO, but not to take the responsibilities and not to accept the standards of NATO. In other words, in my view, it is a potential within this. Still the potential, and for Russia, NATO is much more important than many people do believe about the role of NATO.
This is something which you could see almost before every meeting of the Russia-NATO Council or NATO-Russia Council. They shout at each other, especially the Russians shout at NATO. They say it is a disastrous organization, we don't want to have anything to do. And then it happens, and that is a very positive statement afterwards. We actually have done some useful job. Before I come to Balázs and things dear to him, I want to ask about something very specific and also related to Poland, the missile defense. Do you think that the missile defense problem is genuine for Russia? Or is it one of the tools of influencing the Western policies and perceptions?
So I think that missile defense is a genuine issue for the Russian security leadership. That means the military and other security services and the political leadership. But it's not about missile defense. It's about broader Russian military and security strategy, and it flows from what I argued is at the core of Russia's foreign policy and security, which is this sense of being encircled and threatened. And so when you read Russian military discourse, journals, and the Russian military doctrine, what is clear is a diagnosis, an incorrect diagnosis, I want to emphasize, but a diagnosis that what has happened over the last decade is the greater presence of the United States and NATO, not just in Europe, but throughout Eurasia, the greater capacity for conventional strike, and the greater willingness of the United States and NATO to use military force for political coercion, like in Kosovo, or to overthrow regimes, like in Iraq. And so missile defense is another piece, from the Russian point of view, a piece of a puzzle about a building US-NATO capacity that allows the United States and NATO to act with impunity in circumstances of political
But
coercion in
can it be
Eurasia.
negotiated? Do you
In
believe-
that context, I mean, anything's possible. I think that the argument that NATO has made to Russia that they're wrong in their analysis of missile defense and its capability, and the way to reassure itself of that fact is through transparency and by cooperation and participating in the system, is the right argument, and it is correct. But I think there are those in Russia who don't want to be persuaded that missile defense is not part of this capacity, and as long as they have a blocking ability, we're not going to see progress. But I wouldn't rule out that the sort of instinct to find out what's going on and to participate wouldn't necessarily win in the end.
Thank you very much. Let's move to another part of this equation, that means Eastern Partnership. Reading the literature, in the 50s, the question asked in Washington was, who lost China? Seems to be that in Europe we are asking ourselves the question, who is going to lose Ukraine now? You know, that means that's the question, did we do enough? Did the European Union develop mechanisms and tools of trade to actually persuade the Ukrainians to reform and to be adaptable to the European Union's acquis? I turn to a specialist on Eastern Partnership. Is it dead, as some people say, even in this country, criticizing the Minister Sikorski's policies and European Union's policies? How do you react to the concept of Eastern Partnership?
Thank you for the question, Guy, and a big thank you for inviting me here. It's a great pleasure to be in such a distinguished panel. Well, first of all, it cannot be dead because it's just barely alive. I mean, it's barely born, right? I mean, if you take a look at the Eastern Partnership policy into a historical perspective, it was born finally in 2008 as a reaction of the Orange Revolution, which was in 2004. This is also something which, you know, like putting the EU into a perspective, if we expect that the EU is going to save Ukraine for the West, then we are really wrong. Only the Ukrainians can save Ukraine for the West or go toward the West. And if you take a look at Ukraine, both at the elite and the society side, they are actually going. You know, we just finished a research which was published by the Central European Policy Institute. The society, the values, support for democracy, human rights is all going on for, like, you know, there's an increasing support, not only in Ukraine, but anywhere else. Support for the EU and for the European integration is high. It's more than a majority actually supporting, not only, again, in Ukraine. Compared to that, the state of the EU and the Euro crisis, you know, this is a miracle. Ukrainians want more the EU than the Europeans actually do at this stage, okay? The same can be said by the elites. The European Union and the European delegation is the biggest player, as the only player in Kiev, okay? And not only in Kiev, but in Chisinau and Tbilisi too. The only country which we are not a player is Belarus, where we are not, simply. This is a very little engagement, it's a very little interaction between the EU and Belarus, and that's why. Putting into a perspective,
what is wrong? What is wrong with the policy?
There's nothing wrong with the policy. The issue with the policy that it's just starting. The association agreements is going to be signed only now. There's going to be enacted in the Vilnius summit, at least with Georgia and Moldova. I consider this is the biggest success. Obviously, without Ukraine, and what's going to happen with Ukraine is the main question. This is not going to be analyzed or evaluated as a success, simply because Ukraine is the only country which can sign the actual association agreement. By the way, if you look at the negotiations, these are the nitty-gritty negotiations with all the countries. This is enormous effort by these bureaucracies, the Ukrainians, especially the Moldovans, which have no government capacity, to negotiate with the European Union such a treaty. That also shows a lot of commitment toward even going through this bureaucratic angle. By the way, in Ukraine, you know, we shouldn't forget and give the credit that it was the Yanukovych government who negotiated, and not the Tymoshenko government who negotiated that. So, again, if you look at the perspective, I think we are getting, it's very important what's going to happen in the Vilnius summit. If Ukraine is going to be signed, and it's a big if, obviously, it's going to be a hugely successful Congress. If not, even we have
I will come
incremental
back to
success.
you. Professor Rotfeld, you've been dealing with the continuity in foreign policy, and it's here we have to do with the continuity of culture, including the political culture. Do you think that our expectations from the outset of this policy were far-reached, too optimistic, that the countries like, all countries actually of Eastern Partnership cannot change that quickly? Microphone, please. You have a loud voice, but...
To some extent, you are right, that in fact it is, I would say, a kind of the very specific political culture in Ukraine, and not only in the context of this association agreement, but in general, Ukraine has what I would say a kind of the cognitive dissonance about themselves. They do consider that they are much more attractive, important for the West than they are.
All nations of this region think so.
Yes, but in Ukraine it is...
Only true in Poland.
No, I would like to say that in Poland we have had, I would say, the same. But at the end of the day, people understood that there is a need to be a little bit more humble and to deal with internal problems. It is not popular, it is not an easy task, but nevertheless it was done. In Ukraine, they are still discussing among themselves what kind of the policy, the equal distance to the European Union and to Russia. And because they are convinced that both European Union and Russia and the United States and NATO, they are so much interested to have Ukraine on their own side that they will pay for that. And what I'm telling you, I said to them very bluntly in Kiev that it is wrong, because in fact at the moment not only NATO and European Union, but all the countries, individual countries, they are so much concerned about their own internal domestic policies that everything what is outside of the current problems is, I would say, not very attractive. As far as Russia, in my view, Ukraine is the highest priorities. That at the list of priorities, it is very top, because I would say Russia cannot digest the new situation that Ukraine is an independent country, which is in fact for very long distance. In other words, for them, to some extent, it is as difficult to digest, I would say, the situation as it was between France and Algeria. In fact, 40 years passed for France to accept the new situation. Therefore, one should not be very much astonished that for Russians it is very difficult to understand that it is a new reality for generations, not only for the present generation.
When one discusses the situation in those countries with the sometimes even top representatives, they all stress something which Professor Rotfeld has said, that means geopolitics. And I try to explain that the European Union of 27 members, now 28, cannot just have one single geopolitics. We have 27 geopolitics at the moment. And so it's very difficult to develop a policy. Does Washington have policy towards Eastern Partnership countries? That means, does Washington has a policy towards Ukraine, Georgia, Azerbaijan, Armenia, not to mention Belarus, of course?
Yeah, I mean, I think the United States, actually, for all our talk about are Europe and the United States consistent and coordinating and on the same page, we may not have the same instruments, but our policy is the same. It remains integration, modernization, pluralism, leading towards democracy, economic development.
But there is a feeling that there is less interest.
Well, there's fewer instruments because we don't have the EU. There are bilateral, I don't work in this area, but there are bilateral democracy promotion, civil society programs, but it doesn't come in the same way with a package. I mean, the EU has that extra leverage of coming as a number of countries. I know sometimes it looks like a weakness, but from our point of view, it's a strength, and the leverage that these policies tend to be more integrated, where ours tend to be they come as a broad package, but not really a coherent strategic package. So I do think there's great cohesion. But what I wanted to emphasize is something that I think is common in the challenge the United States faces and Europe faces, and that is common not just with the Eastern Partnership, but also highlighted in the Russia case, which is the premise of our policies for the last 20 years following the end of the Cold War, was that you would be, in effect, working with willing partners in this strategy. That it was difficult, it was politically difficult, the resources weren't there, the know-how, the expertise wasn't necessarily there, and that was the content of the policy and the strategy. What we've seen in the last couple of years especially, and Ukraine's kind of on the brink and is the key case, is that it's not so, well, in some cases it's clear we don't have a willing partner. In Russia it's very clear, the Putin leadership has made clear that it doesn't welcome civil society promotion and democratization and modernization and integration. And certainly Belarus is the outlier case where that has been clear for some time. But the challenge in Ukraine is you have a political leadership where it's not clear they're willing to accept the deal. They want the benefits, but they don't want to accept the costs that come with the benefits. But as Professor Rotfeld has reminded us, what is very clear is that in most of these countries, the societies still, and even not still, even more strongly, want that strategy, seek that modernization, that internationalization and that integration. And when I talk about having to adjust our strategies, that's the main adjustment that we need to address. How to not give up a strategy that was right in its concept and now just needs adjustment in its execution.
Well, I'm always a bit dubious when somebody tries to differentiate between the good society and the bad elite, but actually we have been having difficulty in dealing with the elites of those countries. And I'm going to challenge your optimism, not from the point of view of the institutions developed by the European Union, but from the point of view of actual changes which took place in the East. I mean, what happened to conditionality? What happened to the mechanisms developed, the action plans agreed between the European, the Commission and the countries, which were never executed, but actually the reports look good every year. You know, that means we paid quite a lot of money, we the European Union proudly said, paid the European Union just to have an opportunity of saying that you need to reform. What happened to the reforms?
First of all, let me actually go back just for one sentence to the U.S. policy, because I think it's a very important.
Leave the U.S. policy. You are expert on Eastern Partnership. Go on, Balázs.
I see it's a very important thing that the U.S. actually is still paying for these programs to the democracy promoters, because the EU is just entering this game. So even the U.S. is following the EU on the policy side. It's willing to pay the bill, which is a very important thing. Now, what happened with the conditionality?
Reforms.
The conditionality is there. If you see the entire debate with the association agreement and the DCFTA, which is a deep, free and comprehensive trade agreement, right? It's an economic tool. It's not a political tool. It's not political integration. It's economic integration. This is what the EU does best, and it's politically conditioned. You know, with the political prisoners and with the three conditions. This is essentially a new Copenhagen criteria attached to the Eastern Partnership, but it's not official. So obviously this is actually intimidating a lot Kiev, because these conditionality was added later and not before. That's actually also very important to add. So I see a very strong conditionality vis-a-vis Ukraine and vis-a-vis the other countries. Now, what happened with the reforms? And this is a bit, like I would like to turn this debate, the reforms will happen when the people of Ukraine and other people will want it. Okay, and if you look at the polls,
they don't want it.
Still the paternalistic state is very popular. The post-Soviet area, this is, the individual life strategies and economic benefits is pretty much connected to the government. Rent-seeking is very high, and this issue is disappearing very slowly. There is a decreasing tendency, but it's a very slow tendency, and paternalistic state, attachment to the state, is still there. So reforms, which actually I have to take responsibility into my own hands, it's not that strong. It's growing, even in Belarus, but it's not the most important thing. So let's not expect and accept
you don't want to
that we know that the EU needs to do the reforms for the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians need to do it.
But I believe, Professor Rotfeld, I believe that one of the elements of our optimism was not related to the fact that we didn't pay enough attention to the genuine concerns of the elite of those countries, for example, in security. When we talk about Azerbaijan or Armenia, and we talk about Georgia and Abkhazia and South Ossetia, if we talk about Moldavia and Transnistria, this is security considerations. And isn't that true that the elite of those countries, out of whatever motives, patriotic or whatever, they actually feel that this security consideration goes first before any change takes place?
Before responding to your question, I would like to say, in the context of the elite.
They
in
are
Ukraine.
anarchists. They never
In-
respond to my question.
No, I will respond to this, but I would like to say, since you mentioned that we are very negative about elites and positive about society, I would like to say that elites, they do reflect the society. These elites, they did not emerge, I would say, from Mars. They were generated and motivated by the feelings, expectations, hopes of society. And in this point of, from this point of view, one should say that Ukraine is in much better position, and to some extent, I would say, this is the main line of division, distinction between Ukrainian parliament, for example. You have the party of regions in government, and there are three parties who are in the real opposition. Mm-hmm. They are not appointed by the government, by Yanukovych. They are in real opposition. Our Ukraine, Udarov, Klitschko, and Svoboda, Freedom, Nationalist Party, they are in opposition. In other words, they do represent different fractions of society. In Russia, you have, I would say, State Duma, where it is, I would say, one originally established by the government party, and then all the others were offered a concession for nationalists of Zhirinovsky, communists by Zyuganov, and the third party, Just Russia, of Mironov. In other words, all of them, they do belong to the governing party, but with very special tasks. In other words, in Russia, there is no pluralistic system at all. In Ukraine, it is a pluralism. This is, I would say, point of departure. Now, responding to your question, I would like to say that absolutely you are right. Securitization of the policy in the eastern part of Europe, especially not only in Ukraine, but also in Moldova and the Caucasus, Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, is decisive. And this is, by the way, when I spoke about heterogeneous composition of the present international security system, I have had in mind that in Europe, securitization is the chapter of the past. And for them, it is the reality of the present situation. In other words, between, for example, Georgia, since you mentioned Azerbaijan and Armenia, it is another story connected with the Nagorno-Karabakh, where, in fact, in my view, you didn't raise such a question, but I can imagine that somebody could raise such a question, that the possible conflict definitely is already prepared by both sides, and especially by Azerbaijan. It has to be taken in very serious way, because the military expenditures of Azerbaijan are 6 times higher than they were a few years ago. In other words, it is, I would say, the highest increase of military expenditures. But it is another problem. Georgia, in my view, it is a very important problem for the new definition of a Russian strategy towards the post-Soviet past, post-Soviet space of those nations who are very much dependent on Russia. They are not only dependent because of the political links or because of the political, I would say, infiltration, etc., but they are dependent because of the infrastructure. In other words, when we are discussing about Georgia, we are discussing the export of the mineral water of Borjomi and wines. But the country was, in the past, I would say, in fact, an integral part of unitarian state. It was not a federal. The name of federation was a kind of the facade. But in fact, it was much more centralized than any other state. This is, in my view, still very serious problem.
Okay. So, Celeste, before we come back to Eastern Partnership, do you think that from your point of view, the 2008 war with Georgia was a game changer in terms of relationship of Moscow with the as they call it, new neighborhood of the? Was it a point in this renegotiation of position with the West?
So with the West or with its neighbors?
With the West and with its neighbors.
So it was clearly, well, it settled one question. I'm not sure I thought it was a question, but it settled a question that maybe others had. about whether Russia would use military force in pursuit of its own self-defined national interests. So now that that question's been answered, let's deal with the reality, which is we know that Russia, the Russian leadership, under certain circumstances, is willing to use overwhelming conventional military force against its neighbors. So, you know, I'm not sure what that would be a surprise, but if it was, then I guess it was a game changer. Then it comes back to under what circumstances it considers conditions in the internal politics or security situation of its neighbors to threaten Russian security interests. And again, I think the answer is relatively clear in Russian security documents: foreign policy concept, security concept, and military. And it is conceived in the context of American political and military presence and NATO's political and military presence. But it also, and this gets back to other issues we haven't talked about, which is the Eurasian Union. It also is about economic influence and Russian economic presence in its neighbors. And so that is I'm not trying to be, you know, overly dramatic. I'm not expecting intervention in Ukraine. I'm not expecting Russian intervention. That was, I think, an extreme case. But I think that we need to take seriously that, you know, a Europe whole, free, and at peace is still a distant, is sadly still a distant objective, and our policies do need to not focus on that, but take it into account.
Thank you very much. Balázs, so what to do next? We are going to have a Vilnius summit. You says that Eastern Partnership is not a bad project. It's still working on its grown-up appearance, developing new technology, but we have a country like, for example, Belarus, which is not responding, and you have some, I've heard that during one of the recent conferences you actually said more involvement is needed. Please explain.
Yes, first of all, Belarus is a very good case study for the Eurasian integration as well, because it is the only member out of the Eastern Partnership of the Customs Union. And I think the Russians, this is a showcase for the Russians, and it's also seeing what the Russian strategy really in the region is: pay, or I should say basically bribe, right? Because it's a huge subsidies which the Russians are paying. It's we calculated as well during another research, it goes up to 15-16% of the GDP. You know, so this is something that the Russians are showing.
Subsidies amount to 15-16%
15-16% of the GDP of Belarus, right, in various formats. So they're paying big time. Now, whether the Russians, this is a clear message for the Ukrainians as well. We are willing to pay. Now, interestingly, you know, 70% of the Belarusians, it's a recent poll, think that they're fine with the greater integration with Russia if Russia pays. So it is feeling, and I'm sure that this research and this kind of tendency in the Belarusian society actually gives a lot of headaches to Minsk and to the Belarusian elite, because this is, you know, the researchers call it too pragmatic nation. It's not necessarily what Lukashenko would like to see out of Belarus, right? So this is point number one. Point number two, I want to recognize at least two former presidential candidates in the room. Alexander Milinkiewicz and Ales Mikhalevich is here. So we have a high representation of Belarusians here in the room. What to do with Belarus is, you know, basically, and we always refuse the notion that we isolate Belarus, and I agree with this. We do not isolate Belarus, but we manage to isolate ourselves from Belarus, okay? And this is also a big case. This is the only country where the EU plays no role, and therefore this vacuum is filled by Russia. And not only because Russia pays, you know, but simply because there is no other political player but Russia. Not in the society or for the society. Unfortunately, the civil society and the political opposition is weak enough and repressed enough to not play a more significant role. So what we can do in this format, and I'm trying to think outside of the box. Sanctions, sure. Can we do sanctions in a country where it's open with Russia? Totally. Can we put sanctions on the state companies and they can re-register in a few months in Russia? What we're going to achieve, what we achieve with more sanctions, you know, unless we want to do sanctions on Russia as well, it's more dependency of Belarus to Russia. Okay? So in this situation is, you know, basically what we need to do is more Europe in Belarus, which is not even my axiom, but one of the opposition activists said.
I love the idea. How do you do that?
We'll get to that. There's another axiom which I also like, that let's forget about Lukashenko, and it's not mine, and focus on the country. So let's get to the country and talk to everyone. I think it's still possible to do. You know, let's talk to everyone but Lukashenko and but certain people.
But wouldn't you agree, and Professor Rotfeld here was also a witness and participated in many discussions from the Minister of Foreign Affairs, that actually we've tried everything. We've tried the sanctions, we've tried openness. Sikorski Westerwelle went and talked to, to Lukashenko, presenting him with the options before the elections. He chose to go east. What can you do? Sorry.
I do not have an answer what to do, because in fact, in my view, we are confronted with a new situation in Eastern neighborhood, in a sense that something what in the past organized, it was an organizing principle of the policies, was very much ideologized. In other words, ideology created a kind of the pattern of conduct. At the moment, ideology doesn't play a role at all.
What was the ideology?
Ideology
of democracy,
a
of Europeanization?
totalitarian ideology, I would say, of communist country in the past. It is, to some extent, it is replaced by nationalism, but in fact, the only element which is common for all those countries, it is how to keep power. In other words, they are power-oriented. Now, for Lukashenko, as it is also for the Russian, the only reliable force to keep power, there are uniformed units. I would say not only army, but special services, counterintelligence, all that. It is, I would say, Siloviki. Now, as far as Belarus is concerned, as you remember, it was very popular but wrong understanding that problem between Poland and Russia is connected with the so-called Polish minority in Russia. We do not have minority in Belarus. We do not have minority. There are hundreds of thousands of Poles who were for centuries in Belarus in the period of the in deep history of Lithuanian kingdom. In other words, Lithuania, it was the name, but in fact it was mainly Belarusian. But I would like to say that Poles were forever in that territory. And these Poles, they were accepted by Lukashenko as the integral part of the Belarusian society. They were not discriminated. The problem emerged in the moment when Poles decided in Belarus to elect in democratic way the new leadership of the Poles in the Union of Poles in Belarus. This was the problem. Democracy, not ethnicity. Ethnicity was not only accepted, but they were to some extent even, I would say, privileged, because he considered that they are my own Poles. In other words, he considered them as a kind of the instrument. But in the moment when Polish group decided, I would say, to elect in democratic way, it was a kind of the signal that if it is acceptable for them, it is acceptable for the rest of the country. That was, I would say, a very serious challenge. And in a sense, I would say, we were to some extent the hostages of the situation that many people did not understand what is going on. And I do remember, I have had a lot of the discussion with the High Commissioner on National Minorities, telling him that there is not a problem of the minority, it is a problem of democracy in Belarus. But we are not able to establish democracy. It has to be done by Belarusians. And the Belarusians who are in this room could tell us much better than me why the society is so passive. The passivity of the Belarusian society is, in my view, the main problem, not a problem of relations between Polish authorities and Belarus, but what has to be done to activate the society in Belarus.
Balázs, Ukraine and the Vilnius summit. Do you think we should we, the European Union, should close our eyes and sign on the dotted line on the DCFTA? And what is your?
No, we shouldn't. But we shouldn't close our eyes. And there's conditionality. The EU is in a situation now that I don't think they can afford to close their eyes if they clearly said that there are conditions. So unless these conditions met, or the EU and Ukraine will cook the book somehow together, I don't think that the actual association agreement will be signed. I do think that this is going to be a mistake on the other side. But I do not to sign. But the situation is like that it's impossible to sign unless these conditions are met. And I do believe that now Bankova, I mean, the presidential administration is also looking for a way out, which is not necessarily releasing Yulia Tymoshenko, but I'm not excluding that actually, or finally they're considering. And I think especially after the Strasbourg decision, the European Court of Human Rights decision, I do believe that that was a certain game changer because, you know, everybody expected this decision, but when it came, it's real, right? So I do believe that there are some serious consideration now in Kiev about that. Again, if we're not going to sign, we're going to lose time. You know, we're not putting the only real tool that the EU does have, the association agreement, into place. We will have to wait another year or two until Moldova and Georgia will be able to sign technically, and it's going to be a lot of technical work, the nitty-gritty. So we actually going to lose time. Now, you know, also, like, we are frustrated with the lack of progress. But again, think about the Russians and the Eurasian Union. They want to have the Eurasian Union up and running by 2015. Both Kazakhstan and Belarus said they don't want it, okay? No one else is attracted. Ukraine is clearly, you know, like they actually ask for a membership status, which is impossible by the customs union. There's no such a status. This is also showing, you know, the difference between the European Union and the Eurasian integration, right? And the biggest difference, and I'm from Slovakia, I know from this region, Visegrad, the Baltics, we had a European dream. We were willing to pay a price. This is a sustainable process, you know, and the Belarusians are willing to get paid for the Eurasian integration. And it's a huge difference. Now, two more things for what to do in Belarus, because I have a feeling that we did not answer. And I want to highlight two things, okay? A, yes, we have a feeling that we tried everything, but we didn't try long enough or strong enough. You know, we said, oh, we're in the dialogue, but we really was not really serious. We're saying now we have sanctions. Really? We don't. You know, there's no binding sanctions. They're actually intimidating Minsk, but it's not enough to have a policy impact, okay? And we have, again, the consideration of Russia and how open Belarus toward Russia is actually where both Minsk and the European Union thinks alike. Now, what is going on in Belarus, though? Just a few things. 40% of Belarusians now want their own. They manage their own hand. So the economic democracy, as we call it, is actually increasing, which is a very important sign. The second, Lukashenko is laying off 25% of the bureaucrats from July 1st. There's no money, okay? And number three, there are 165,000 registered entrepreneurs and enterprises only in last year, which makes one business for every 160 Belarusians. So what I would do now is business education, and the second thing, civic education. Because in many ways what we see, and you know, going back, if no sanctions, what really Minsk is fearing is talk. They don't want to talk. They don't want to talk about values. They don't want to talk about democracy. They don't want to talk about, you know, because they know that they would lose the argument. So the more we talk, the more we getting there to, you know, to get it into our way.
Thank you. Celeste.
Yeah, I want to emphasize one thing too, because I was pretty, I want to emphasize one thing, which is I agree on being long-term. Just because you've tried something before doesn't mean conditions may not have shifted so that it may work. And the other piece of this is I agree. The model, the Putin model isn't going to work over the long term. It is unsustainable. The economies don't work. These economies need trade. They need modernization. The political elites need economies that work because they need the resources. And these societies need, I mean, there's a lot of work yet to be done. So patience, commitment, a more strategic approach, thinking about in the near term, continuing to build capacity and relationships, and recognizing that over time these political models just are not going to work. They're too close to Europe. The societies are linked in various ways to Europe, and so making that commitment, I think, is the takeaway that we should not despair, not, you know, sort of throwing up your hands and walking away from it.
Thank you. All right, ladies and gentlemen, the floor is yours. Please, there is a microphone or two here. Please tell clearly who you are, and if you have an institutional association, please mention the institution. Here we have a gentleman in the third row.
My name, is it on?
Yeah, it's on.
My name is Chris Holzen. I'm with the International Republican Institute. My question is for whoever would like to answer it. Following the military action by Russia in Georgia, I got the sense that the United States started paying a lot more attention to Crimea as being a potential place for similar activities. And I'm wondering if that feeling is still there, and if you could just say a little bit about what your expectations may be for Crimea and its future, let's say, more integration with Ukraine.
Is someone who would like to ask a question about this part, about Crimea, about the south of Ukraine? No. Crimea?
So I guess I'll answer as best I can the U.S. part and the more military part, but I would defer about more the social part, which I'm going to point to, which is, without being too flip about it, I don't think Russia needs to militarily occupy Crimea, because it kind of already does, because of the Black Sea Fleet, and because of the new agreement on the long-term basing of the Black Sea Fleet in Crimea. I've only been to Crimea once, and there's a pretty strong, as everyone here who knows Ukraine knows, pretty strong Russian presence. And I don't see it as being a flare-up. I mean, it seems to me that the more interesting challenge for the Ukrainian government is how to respect and manage that local presence, but also, while maintaining Ukrainian sovereignty and also Ukrainian, ethnic, the Ukrainian minority presence in its own country. So I don't think that there was more attention or concern. I can't speak for current U.S. policy, but when I did serve, I don't think there was a great deal of concern about Crimea and Russian presence per se. And there was a great deal of focus, though, in continuing and sustaining what was and is a very strong bilateral defense relationship with Ukraine. And one of the strongest areas of that is actually with the Ukrainian Navy, because that just is an institutional record that has worked. So I guess, yes, there's a recognition about Russian presence, not an urgent concern about a Abkhazia or a South Ossetia scenario, but an interesting management project that goes beyond the military presence to issues of politics and society.
What I heard talking to the officials in the Crimea is that they have been trying in the last 2 years to limit the scope of action of the Russian fleet, not in military sphere, but in economic, because they actually pretend as they would own the whole territory. So the Ukrainian authorities try to push them back and tell them there is a limit. Here is your territory, you can do whatever you want, but you can't do it in town, for example. And they try to create some small economic monopolies, and with money going, we know where. All right, Balázs, something on Crimea?
Yeah, just a few thoughts. I think we need to recognize when we talk about Crimea, one thing, that there's a very strong regional Crimean identity. This is not only Russians per se. Obviously, most of them are from Russia, or was actually, taken there generations ago, and the Crimean Tatars left. But there is one thing with the Crimean elite, both the Tatars and the Crimean elite, pro-Russia or Russian elite, agrees that they need peace for the tourism. If there's no tourism, there's no Crimea. End of the story, which is a very important and very strong factor.
Okay.
Yeah, exactly, what Abkhazia is now learning. So this is, I wouldn't neither overestimate the threat, but the society is actually getting into understanding, and there is a strong elite who actually is able to manage.
Thank you. Questions? Go ahead. Sir, in this third row here, gentlemen, and then you. All right.
My name is Walt Slocum from the Atlantic Council. You've given a pretty pessimistic picture of the internal Russian situation. And even given the very strong, you mentioned the Ambassador Rotfeld mentioned the power of the uniformed services of Siloviki. What are the forces, if any, inside Russia that could, over the long run, produce some change in the system, or is this something we're going to have to live with and accept it as a reality rather than hope it'll change?
That is a pessimistic question.
May I? Very good question, because in my view, I will illustrate in very simple way. Being the member of this group of experts preparing the new strategic concept of NATO, the whole group, 12 persons, we decided to visit Russia in February 2010. And I would like to say that we have had 5 different meetings in Russia in 2 days, in State Duma, in Foreign Ministry, in the National Security Council, and with meeting with students and meeting at the Academy of Sciences. And all the meetings with officials in Foreign Ministry, State Duma, and National Security Council, they repeated, I would say, more or less the same arguments in different forms and ways, but it was the same, that the NATO is an instrument of the Cold War against Russia, and in fact, NATO is responsible for everything what is negative. Russia is surrounded by the enemies. In Russian Academy of Sciences, they were best Russian experts, about 60 persons. The meeting was very long, and they told us, don't take it seriously. In fact, we have an enemy, but it is not the West. Our relations with the West are at the moment the best. There is no threat posed towards Russia by the West. We have problems. The problems are in the south with the world of Islam, and in the Far East with China. Nobody is speaking about that, but it is a real problem. All the rest, it is a kind of the rhetoric. I would like to say that not for everybody it is a rhetoric. I mentioned at the very beginning that this rhetoric is very intensively used as an instrument of consolidation of society around the leadership of the country. In other words, this is, by the way, one of the problems, that you never know what has to be taken seriously in the Russian documents and what is, I would say, for the internal domestic use. Because very often the same people are telling you something totally different privately, what they are saying in public. I do remember, as the member of the advisory board on disarmament matters at the United Nations, I have had a very, very close conversation, sitting next to my colleague from China, who was the deputy foreign minister, and who told me what he thinks about some very specific issues. And then he took the floor. It was behind the closed doors, but nevertheless, privately, he said to me something, and then for the rest, not in public, but I would say for the rest of the group, he said something totally different. And when he finished, I asked him, whispering, why did you say something what you, in fact, you don't believe? He said, because for you, I said what is my view. For them, I said what I have to say on behalf of my country. And this is, I would say, the problem, that you never know to what extent people in official documents are reflecting their own views, to what extent it is, I would say, for the propaganda, as a propaganda tool. And I would like to say that, in my view, Russia is very much diversified. It is not the same Russia as it was 20 years ago, but on the other hand, the tendency at the moment, definitely in recent year, it is very, I would say, the source of very serious concern. And I would like to say that, in my view, it is a problem. And I would like not to oversimplify, but it seems to me that Russia is divided to a great extent, having in mind, I would say, the future of security in the world. It is a problem what kind of situation will be within Russia and Russia's relations with the rest of those members in Central Asia. Especially, and I would like to say, nobody mentioned up to now that the main problem of the world is the problem with failing and failed states. What happened in North Africa, in Syria. We are not discussing about Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan. In fact, they are failed states. And nobody who is going, I would say, to manage, I would say, to help, to assist. Russia is for them a kind of the only power who can offer them an assistance. And I would like not to present this as a simple problem, but it is very, very serious problem for all of us to think what kind of future of Russia, having in mind, I would say, the recent decisions which were taken against the civic society and the open society in Russia.
I just want to add very quickly, because I know we want to get to lots of questions. In answer to the question, I entirely agree that the picture of the Russian leadership and the political system is grim, but the picture of Russia as a country, Russia now is not Russia of 20 years ago, and that's exactly why the leadership now is locking down in civil society, sees threats everywhere, doesn't want this diversity of views and interests and expertise to play a role, because it undermines the form of political system that the leadership depends upon. So that's why I'm saying don't despair. We need to keep up those links. We need to keep up exchanges. Russian students still need to come to Europe. There's more anti-Americanism, but there's still a positive view of Europe in most of Russian society. So this is not, the pessimism about the political leadership is not a recommendation for despair about Russia.
Thank you. Questions? Yes.
Łukasz Grajewski, portal on Eastern Partnership. I have another question to Professor Rotfeld, and it's related to what you just said. What is your opinion on Euro-Asian Union? Is it a real possibility to recreating Soviet Union in this new modernized way? Thank you.
No, I will tell you, some people believe in Russia that it is possible to re-establish Soviet Union. As you remember, in April 2005, President Putin made a speech statement. He said that the collapse of the Soviet Union, it was the greatest strategy, the greatest catastrophe of the 20th century, geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. And I do remember this date and the situation because I participated in the meeting in Brussels behind the closed doors. I didn't know that he made such a statement. When I left outside the room, people, journalists surrounded me asking what I'm thinking about. I said, may I ask you to repeat what he said? And they told me that it is the greatest geopolitical catastrophe. I said, probably it is a linguistic mistake. The president wanted to say that the real geopolitical catastrophe was the establishment of the Soviet Union. That was, I would say, because I would say for more than 70 years, Russia was marginalized. And now for Russia, it is a chance to be back in this philosophy of inclusiveness, to be back within the mainstream of civilized European nations. And I do believe that sooner or later it will be the case. In other words, I would like to say that this Euro-Asian Union is considered by some people in Russia as a chance, opportunity to re-establish Soviet Union. It is not possible. In other words, the Russian way of thinking within the leadership and some people of older generation is that balance of power is decisive. And in my view, for the security of the 21st century, balance of power is the wrong concept, because there is no, because in case that you are raising the question balance of power, then the first problem is balance with whom? Between whom? Between Russia and the rest of the world? Between Russia and China and the United States, etc.? No. In my view, it is a need to elaborate a new concept of the security. And I would like to say that I'm rather optimistic that it will be done. I'm very much pessimistic that it will be done in my lifetime.
Thank you so much.
Hello, I'm Tamar Lovjanice, Georgian student in Wroclaw. I'd like to bring your attention to Georgia. We elected new government, and they tried to regulate their relationship with Russia and tried to bring the new perspective. But the thing is, recently, Russian troops shifted the border about 300 meters into Georgia, administrative border. And I'd like to know the European perspective and the idea of these kind of developments in Georgia. How do you think, how can we deal with this problem? And as Georgia is incapable of dealing it alone, what you suggest and what are the perspectives, because as well as the European Union monitoring mission is not that, how to say, effective, yes.
I
Thank
will
you.
tell you, raise the question that it is not possible to give you very simple answer. I have had an opportunity to participate in the independent international group on to establish the fact-finding mission on the war in Georgia. It was with Heidi Tagliavini group established by the European Union, and I have to say that in my view, the problem could be resolved, but it could be done in a very delicate way. There is a need to deal in discretion with an intention to accept some realities and recognize that some ties are, so to say, very deep-rooted in the history and also as the face-saving device. In other words, I'm not the best person, I would say, at the moment to tell you what kind of solution could be done. In case that somebody would ask me, I would say that it seems to me that it is not without a chance, but there is a need to have rather the policy of discretion than the policy of public, I would say, public presentation.
Well, thank you very much. I'm not sure we can answer this question, but the fact of the 5 minutes, then we end at 1. They are giving me all those signs all the time here, you know. But we won't be diverted. Interestingly enough, that there were no international protests. That Georgia didn't appeal to its allies, like for example the United States, for action. And the United States didn't come with the initiative to help Georgia in that. So it's wait-and-see attitude a bit. But of course, Russia is testing the water. A gentleman in the back.
Thank you. Mubariz Rahimli, I am from Azerbaijan Republican Alternative Public Movement. I have a question to Mr. Rotfeld. You said that Azerbaijan military budget increasing, but you didn't mention that there are a Russian military base in Armenia, and Armenia has a strong Russian military support. And my question is, what Azerbaijan government has to do if this conflict didn't solved over 20 years, and internationally recognized Azerbaijani territories still under Armenian occupation? What is the European role? What kind of role European Union can play on solving this problem?
I will rephrase a bit this question because it's very specific, and here I'm afraid that Professor Rotfeld wouldn't be able to give the answer, but more broadly, because you have dealt with so-called frozen conflicts, and you've dealt with the Moldova personally. What do you think? Those frozen conflicts can be very easily unfrozen, as we have seen in the past. What do you think should be the attitude of the Western powers toward them? European Union, NATO, US?
You know, this type of meetings, they are usually within the language of political correctness, and therefore it is very difficult to discuss. But I will not respect political correctness by saying the following: that we were in these 20 years twice very close to find a solution, and definitely an increase of military expenditure and the preparation for the war, it is not promising a kind of the solution. It is a kind of the signal that the war sooner or later will be, so to say, erupted. I would like to say that, in my view, one should at the moment prevent the possible military conflict in this region. And then it is possible to come back to the steps which were taken in these 20 years, both by Azerbaijan and Armenia, in order to find the political solution. I do understand, I would say, that it is not only the problem of the territory, it is not only the problem of resources, it is mainly the problem of dignity and the problem of psychology. And one should take under consideration to respect psychology in both among the Azeris and Armenians. In other words, I would like to say that, in my view, at the moment, I would say, what is done by the present government of Azerbaijan, it is not the right way to find the solution.
Thank you very much. 1 o'clock is coming. I'm afraid that the young staff of the Wroclaw Global Forum is going here, come with some Cossacks, you know, to remove me from the scene and the rest of the panel.